US, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dan Shevock, who is, like me, in Pennsylvania today. And Dan's talk is titled, I picked up a piece of paper, that was so slick. Dan's talk is titled, Eudaimonic Living Through Eco-Literacy. Dan, please take the floor.
Okay, yeah, for anybody who prefers to read along, I posted the link to my academia page. This is a red paper though. Okay, an essential part to living well in the 21st century involves knowing our responsibilities in relation to climate change and other ecological crises. Music teachers have distinctive opportunities for cultivating eco-literacy, our students and our own, through music and education praxis. For some music teachers, these opportunities may seem beyond our disciplinary scope, but music philosopher Charlene Morton cautioned against this narrow view, which leads to disciplinary fragmentation. She wrote that music education should be thinking more broadly about the nature and the value of music and ways that resist the reduction of music education to teaching and learning music. The purpose of the current essay is to clarify music educators' eudaimonic living through eco-literacy. In this paper, I suggest choosing to act ecologically involves listening for the transforming and conserving impulses. I treat these impulses as spiritual and philosophical. In other words, as music teachers, we ask ourselves what we need to transform and what we need to conserve. In the current paper, I use the writings of Paulo Freire to outline the transforming impulse and of Russell Kirk, the conserving impulse. These texts are treated as typical. A more recent influential publication, Pope Francis's Laudato Si, is analyzed to exemplify the two impulses in relation to living the good life, specifically within a Catholic intellectual tradition. Finally, I make the musical aspects of eudaimonic living through eco-literacy, understood as living the two impulses in relation to the self, communities, and nature, explicit using recent eco-musicological scholarship. Eco-literacy. The portmanteau eco-literacy is derived from the pedagogical term literacy and the study of biological organisms and their environments, ecology. Literacy refers to the capacity to read and write, and more generally, understanding any subject. It is in the second meaning that literacy is often used in educational philosophy. Literacy comes from the Latin literatus, meaning informed, scholarly, refined, and knowledgeable. Ecology, in contrast, refers to the study of the house or dwelling place. In this case, the house under study is the natural world, including human and non-human animals, geologic places, and living interactions. A focus on eco-literacy, then, provides opportunities for understanding the self in ways beyond the individual and beyond merely anthropocentric conceptions of society. As Catholic eco-theologian Thomas Berry wrote, quote, since the human survives only within the larger complex of ecosystems, any damage done to other species or to the other ecosystems or to the planet itself eventually affects human, and not only in terms of physical well-being, but also in every other phase of human intellectual understanding, aesthetic expression, and spiritual development, end quote. David Orr broke the ground of teaching for eco-literacy in his 1992 book, Ecological Literacy. The aim of this teaching practice is, quote, the ecologically literate person who has the knowledge necessary to comprehend interrelatedness and an attitude of care or stewardship. Ecological literacy further implies a broad understanding of how people and societies relate to each other and to natural systems and how they might do so sustainably, end quote. Eco-literacy, then, is the cultivation of a critical literacy required to understand ourselves, our relationship to others, human and not, and explicitly our relationship to nature in these ecologically challenging times. I have linked this concept of critical literacy to eco-literacy to Freirean pedagogy, which is transformative, and the concept of sustainability implies a type of conservatism. The two impulses are active in our description of eco-literacy. Eudaimonia. The word eudaimonia is a vital idea in philosophical discourse. It emerged from the Greek meaning good spirit, genius, demon. You think demon like in the HBO series. It is often synonymous with flourishing, happiness, and well-being. Elliott and Silverman suggested eudaimonia occurs in music education when we pause to reflect on living life well and recognize how this is linked to specific communities and society. In a recent edited book, 2 chapters demonstrated some applicability to the current analysis. David Orr wrote the first of these chapter, speculating about the power of music to help do what rationality alone and appeals to profit have failed to do. Orr suggested that our definition of eudaimonia must include, quote, the well-being of all humans, all animals, all ecologies for all time, end quote. This suggestion is harmonious with my call 5 years ago for eco-literate music pedagogy, for music educators to adopt an eco-centric ethical position, viewing as intrinsic the value of human and non-human being and music. In her chapter, June Boyce-Tillman discussed the eudaimonic dispositions and abilities, including, quote, ethical behavior, including towards the self and environment, relationships of mutuality, respect, contemplation, and relationships with spirits of the ancestors and celestial beings, end quote, and others. Of particular interest for the teacher interested in living well through eco-literacy, Boyce-Tillman discussed ethical behavior in connection to both the self and the natural environment. She recommended transforming students' understanding by venerating the materials we use in class. For instance, in relation to a tree that gave its life for violin students' use, she wrote, quote, in traditional societies, the player would regard him or herself as continually in relationship with that tree, end quote. In Waste and Popular Music Education, I connected our field's unjust relationship with instruments in music classrooms to Lafontaine de Niskia's criticism of destructive tonewood felling in the global south for music classes in the global north. Lafontaine used the indigenous Quechua concept of suma kase to a broader concept similar to the English word community, to recommend social justice be coupled with having harmonious relationships with the natural world. In this type of community, we continually question the distinction between human persons and nature. This conception then places ecocentric questioning at the center of eudaimonic living. Another idea within the Latin American aegis of Buen Vivir is the Bolivian Aymara indigenous concept, summa comania, which relates to the term well-being. According to Artaraz and Calistani, summa comania emphasizes harmonious relationships among human beings and nature, which non-indigenous concepts of sustainability and well-being fail to make. Though full descriptions of summa kase and summa comania are beyond the scope of this paper, it seems important that scholars point readers toward specific concepts in their search for eudaimonia. I agree that social justice ought to be inseparable from right relationship with the natural world, that eudaimonia requires both, and also that remedies to our ecological crises, which are also well-being crises, can often be found in traditional indigenous knowledge systems. Waste that music teachers embody in classroom materials we use is taught to students. Students hear waste as normal. Vincent Bates calls this, quote, waste compounded many times over by reinforcing in the minds of children the unquestioned goodness and necessity of technological innovation, end quote. In schools, we produce material and metaphorical waste. To counter waste, I made 6 recommendations in that paper, which you can read on your own. Turning these recommendations over, each point becomes a guideline for music teachers' eudaimonic living through eco-literacy. 1, because humans are creative beings, embedding the ideal of constructivism in teaching helps teachers flourish. 2, music teachers benefit from feelings of spiritual uplift. 3, music teachers thrive when we have connections to lived places beyond the school walls. 4, music teachers live well when we are slow to waste materials we use. And 5, eudaimonia in the 21st century can mean looking beyond at our narrow cultural windows, even while respecting our own traditions and ancestors. On to the 2 impulses. I contend that regardless of political party affiliation, music teachers experience 2 main impulses, the transforming and the conserving impulse. These are apparent at the macro societal levels. For instance, modern liberals in the US might emphasize transformative possibilities for government institutions, and conservatives emphasize conserving options. At the more localized conceptual, communities, families, and individuals want to transform some material objects, relationships, and processes, and to conserve others. As a model for eudaimonic living through eco-literacy, micro levels of community, family, and person seem to take precedence. A transforming impulse. Reflecting on the concrete challenges of life for many people can lead to the recognition of a need for transformation, but not automatically so. Injustice can be cloaked, and many oppressors have cloaked oppression because they benefit from it. Transformative pedagogy is perhaps best embodied in the work of the Brazilian philosopher Paulo Freire. His pedagogy proceeds in 2 stages. Quote, in the first, the oppressed unveil the world of oppression and through the praxis commit themselves to its transformation. In the second stage, in which the reality of oppression has already been transformed, this pedagogy ceases to belong to the oppressed and becomes a pedagogy for all people and all processes in a process of permanent liberation, end quote. To date, Freirean pedagogy has worked on this initial step, commitment to unveiling oppression and transforming of the world. Oppressive teachers, even those who do not realize that they are oppressors, use the banking concept of education, which focuses exclusively on discipline-specific training, depositing information into the heads of students who become passive. According to Freire, the banking concept of education is dehumanizing. One does not liberate people by alienating them. Liberation is a praxis, the action and reflection of men and women upon their world in order to transform it. Transformative education, then, must begin by putting educational structures, curricula, and daily activities in the hands of students. Students learn to transform the world by being given the space to transform the classroom and building agency. The pedagogy of a transformative music teacher is to first help students unveil oppressions and then to assist them as they work to transform the oppressive society. In relation to eco-literacy, many ecologically destructive aspects of our society are cloaked for many people. Climate denial has reached the highest level of government. Many music teachers are unaware of the ecological cost of sound technology, including commodities with short life expectancies and digital music relying heavily on server farms. A teacher informed by the transformative impulse begins by unveiling these challenges and opening space for students to lend a hand in the transformation of society. But this conception of the transforming impulse may not be enough when it comes to sustaining environments and cultures. Esteban, Stutchell, and Prakash criticized Freirean transformation as counterproductive and ecologically destructive. As they wrote, quote, for the oppressed, the social majorities of the world, education has become one of the most humiliating and disabling components of their oppression, perhaps even the very worst, end quote. Education, as it is institutionalized, even in transformative literacy programs, produces 2 classes of people, the educated and the undereducated. They argue it is impossible to overcome this through education. Following this argument, perhaps transformation requires us to work to diminish the need for education, rather than repackaging new curricula and technologies that will always be, sometimes barely, inferior to curricula and technologies available to the children of capitalists. Esteban, Stutchell, and Prakash continued, quote, Marx observed that the blind compulsion to produce too many useful things would end up producing too many useless people. The current global escalation of educational needs only accelerates the process. And although capital has more appetite than ever, it has not enough stomach to digest everyone. Globalized markets simply cannot absorb the masses. Increasingly, people become disposable human beings. Capital cannot use or exploit them. However, by giving them with public funds access to knowledge packages, capital educates them as consumers and prepares them for the moment in which it can subsume them again in the system of exploitation, end quote. Learning this capitalist conception from education, students leave long sustainable cultures and become part of an economy that destroys Mother Earth. The educationally successful become oppressors and often claim ecological naivete while they skirt the issues. And the dropouts come to believe that dropping out is their own fault, that their elders and their communities and their traditions have nothing to teach them about living the good life. A conserving impulse. In the US, I am identified as a liberal. That is, I lean politically pretty far left of center. As a product of a small rural central Pennsylvania town, my politics incline towards labor, socialism, anarchism, and localism, informed by Catholic social teachings of solidarity and subsidiarity, which I have learned from childhood. Even so, as a philosophical or spiritual impulse, I feel both the need to transform and to conserve. I understand that the conserving impulse is, in this section, I draw on, to understand it, I draw on the traditionalist conservative political theorist Russell Kirk. Kirk clarified the conservative impulse in Western culture in his 1953 book, The Conservative Mind, drawing on historical figures like Edmund Burke, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Disraeli, George Santayana, and T.S. Eliot. Kirk identified 6 canons of conservative thought, and I'll quote these. 1, belief in a transcendent order or body of natural law with rules society as well as conscious, affection of the proliferating variety and mystery of human existence, as opposed to narrow uniformity, egalitarianism, and utilitarian aims of most radical systems, conviction that civilized society requires orders and classes as against the notion of a classless society, persuasion that freedom and property are closely linked, 5, faith in prescription and distrust of sophisters, calculators, and economists who would reconstruct society upon abstract designs, and 6, recognition that change may not be salutary reform, hasty innovation may be a devouring conflagration rather than a torch of progress, end quote. Personally, I read each of these points differently. Some represent what I consider the worst of conservatism in the US, but others, when read from an ecological perspective, open space for following my conserving impulse. For instance, when reading Canon 2, I feel the urge to preserve a variety of traditions and recognize my spiritual instinct in considering the mysteries of God and creation. In Canon 4, I feel an instinctual revulsion from the word property. But if I replace it with land, I recognize that freedom and land are linked. The history of the US has been a theft of land from the indigenous communities, just as the history of capitalism has been a theft of the commons from the people. Karl Marx wrote, quote, the spoliation of the church's property, the fraudulent alienation of state domains, the robbery of the common lands, the usurpation of feudal and clan property conquered the field for capitalistic agriculture, made soil part and parcel to capital, and created for town industries the necessary supply of free and outlawed proletariat, end quote. This feels unusual to find congruence between Kirk and Marx, as Marx would have understood Kirk as naive, and Kirk saw Marx as dangerous. And though I suspect Kirk's and my own conclusions from Canon 4 are different, the canon can hold true with a small modification. As quoted in Kirk, T.S. Eliot wrote, quote, conservatism is too often conservation of the wrong things. Liberalism is relaxation of discipline, revolution, a denial of permanent things, end quote. This seems to have been true in the technological revolution, where billionaires designate themselves liberals and decimate our common home. For instance, journalist Jeff Dembicki outlines the economic interests that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have in coal burning utilities and in transporting Canada's tar sands, one of the most destructive oil sources we have. These industries destroy local economies and traditional societies, especially indigenous communities. Often, in defense of liberal billionaires' mechanism, I hear that you can never go back, that change is inevitable. To resist this denial of permanent things is to follow your conservative impulse, to strain to make permanent the right things. Community, ecosystems, and well-being is essential work for eudaimonic living. Transforming and conserving in dialectic. In this section, I draw on the transforming and conserving impulses as dialectical, as two conceptions of eudaimonic living in confrontation, and at the community, family, and personal levels, resolving the dialectic is essential for living the good life. Analyzing the two impulses in dialectic may help understand eudaimonic living in ecologically challenging time. Pope Francis published his second encyclical, Laudato Si, on care for our common home in 2015. This document on Catholic environmentalism considers poverty, science, and modernism, technology, urban planning, agriculture, biodiversity, and other topics in an integrated way, what Francis calls an integral ecology. As a Catholic encyclical, it is by definition conservative. It is institutional and represents Kirk's 6 canons outlined above, but it also is transformative. These two aspects do not seem to be at odds in integral ecology. Pope Francis wrote, quote, "We require a new and universal solidarity. All of us can cooperate as instruments of God for the care of creation, each according to his or her own culture, experience, involvements, and talents," end quotes. He connects climate change to waste and a throwaway culture that wastes creation and people, and understands climate as a common rather than as individual good. Francis took up the issue of water, describing drinkable water as a human right, and analyzing the loss of biodiversity. He discussed non-human species as having intrinsic value. All of this he links to the breakdown of society, unsustainably large cities, privatization of public space, and technological innovation, which can produce a sort of mental pollution. Francis further connects the ecological crises to global inequality and challenges the weak responses produced by the alliance of economy and technology. A solution is to be found in what he calls the gospel of creation, which posits that all living creatures have intrinsic value in God's judgment. This leads Francis to advance an integral ecology, which considers the environment, economic and social ecology, cultural ecology, daily life, and the principle of the common good and intergenerational justice. Some of these concepts appear to be transformative and others conservative. Nonetheless, they are synthesized under the idea of integral ecology. Music educators do not have to accept integral ecology as their synthesis, but synthesizing the transforming and conserving impulses seems necessary. Music teachers can direct the transforming and conserving impulses towards ecological ends for human and non-human musical communities. For instance, within soundscape ecology, ecologically minded musicians aim to transform and even overcome modernity. Eco-musicologist James Reese Edwards draws on Marxian authors to recommend that we analyze the history of music critically. To exemplify, he discussed Japanese cricket song, which took form during the Edo period, 1603 to 1868, when crop shortages prompted famine and riots. Though economic in origin, insects were blamed for the shortages, and a singing insect selling industry emerged in the late 17th century, continuing through the early 20th century, and developed into a bourgeois travel industry to places famed for seasonal perceptual practices. In this analysis, Edward intends to hold the dialectic between reason, critique, and soundscape conservation in tension. Conserving soundscapes, along with endangered species, has become the aim for many governments, conservation groups, and musicians. Perhaps the transforming and conserving impulses may be dialectically resolved into a single impulse that transforms or conserves as needed, with need being defined by communities, families, and persons, rather than larger global structures that reify only the will of billionaire capitalists. The community, family, and person dialectic may become an ongoing philosophical and spiritual practice for music teachers rooted in villages of human and non-human persons, Western and non-Western ways of knowing and being, music teachers in place. For the music teacher in place, eudaimonic living through eco-literacy is a practice of love, transforming love and conserving love. Bell Hooks calls this being guided by love, not anthropocentric human-only love, but love of all creation. And I'll end with a quote by Bell Hooks. To be guided by love is to live in community with all life. However, a culture of domination, like ours, does not strive to teach us how to live in community. As a consequence, learning to live in community must be a core practice for all of us who desire spirituality and education. Thank you.